Hatshepsut was one of the most important pharaohs in Egyptian history. But how did she achieve this when she was not supposed to be queen in the first place? In this episode of Humble History, we will cover Hatshepsut's unlikely rise and reign. Let's get into it right now. Hatshepsut was born 1458 BC. She was the oldest daughter of the then pharaoh of Egypt, Thutmose I. As princess, she was named Egypt's highest priestess. She learned the incantations and rituals required of priestesses, as it was believed that they could speak directly with the gods. But on a much more political basis, Hatshepsut would have learned of how influential her priesthood was in the mind of the Egyptian citizens and the nobility. Hatshepsut's position as high priestess of the country was a strategic advantage for her father, the king. Being a woman had disqualified her from being an heir. She was not married and had no children that would fight for the throne. She represented her father in Memphis while he dealt in the other cities of Egypt. Hatshepsut was loyal to her father, showing no interest in the throne. She was playing her role as a princess, and her position in society seemed secure. This would change following the deaths of her two brothers, the oldest of the king's sons. 10 years into his reign, when her father died, she was the only daughter of the king by name. She would have to marry one of her brothers as queen. Although this is strange for our time, in this period of ancient Egypt, it was common for royals to marry family members to maintain the purity of their lineage. For example, Hatshepsut's father, Thutmose I, was chosen because his predecessor was sterile, since his parents were siblings. Therefore, Hatshepsut marrying her half-brother was not a foreign concept to the Egyptians. What was strange was her half-brother's age. Her half-brother, Thutmose II, was still a boy when he became king. He was unhealthy with an enlarged heart and pockmarked skin. He was the third son of his father. He never expected to be king. When he had to pick a wife, Hatshepsut was the natural strategic choice because of her position as high priestess. The length of Thutmose II's reign is debated by historians, ranging 3 to 10 years. Regardless, because of his illness, he died young, with only having toddlers at that point from his many wives and no appointed heir. A new pick had to be selected from Thutmose II's toddlers. Priests and oracles were called in to interpret the will of the gods. The priests carried a statue of the god Amun around Thutmose's children until fate had pushed them to place it on the 2-year-old prince, who was crowned Thutmose III. At least this was how it looked on the surface. Some historians suspect there was a secret political power behind the decision. Thutmose III's mother came from a family of little wealth and influence. We see this clearly when the priests decide that it is not Thutmose's mother who will be his regent, but rather Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut's pick as regent would have most likely calmed the minds of the public and the powerful nobles. The nobles saw Hatshepsut as someone who would continue the status quo, keeping the powerful in power, and seen as someone that could be manipulated. Hatshepsut, however, had plans of her own, and this is when we see the beginning of the rise to the throne. Hatshepsut knew in order to maintain her power, she had to have the support of the elites. To this end, we see her exchanging political posts for influence and support. As historian Kara Cooney writes, bit by bit, this female monarch lost economic and political influence in the long term in order to keep it in the short term. Hatshepsut also gave away the state funds to the most powerful of nobles to buy their alliances. Placating elites with wealth and status was a common practice, but Hatshepsut had given more than any of the predecessors in her dynasty. However, Hatshepsut made sure to control the treasury and only appointed the most loyal officials to work there. She spent more of her own grand temples, statues, and construction projects without reserve. When the royal treasury was running out of cash, she reverted to the tactic that any of her predecessors would use to replenish funds: war. Hatshepsut was no pacifist. She sent campaigns to the south into Kush and Nubia multiple times. She made sure to raid her enemies' coffers and have the Egyptian treasury filled to the brim with gold. These exploits also struck terror in Egyptians' northern colonies and dispelled any idea of rebellion. Seeking further wealth but not by war, Hatshepsut sent expeditions to the land of Punt. Historians do not know exactly where Punt was located but agree it was in the Horn of Africa. To the Egyptians at the time, Punt was almost a legendary land where few had made the full journey. When Hatshepsut sent ships to Punt, she had the oracles declare their success ahead of time. We can only imagine her excitement when the ships actually returned, filled with priceless aromas that the Egyptians loved, including frankincense, myrrh, incense, ebony, hardwood, and others. This made the queen only more popular with her people. Besides these trade and war expeditions, Hatshepsut, who was always insecure about her position, had built some of the most notable construction achievements in Egypt's history. Perhaps the most notable construction was her temple built in the desert on the west bank of the Nile, nestled into a great half-moon bay of cliffs sacred to the goddess of Hathor, to build her temple of millions of years. According to Karakuni, the selection of the site smacked of great confidence or extraordinary insecurity, or both. Hatshepsut picked the most visible, the most sacred, the most beautiful place in southern Egypt. Regardless of the reason, the temple of millions of years served almost as a cinema where the elites could see the achievements she had created during her kingship. A story of her own making, starting with how the god Amun had impregnated her mother, Ahmus, who gave birth to Hatshepsut, the miracle child. Continuing to talk about her father Thutmose I's reign and how she had always been his heir as his older daughter. The next story talks about the twin obelisks she had erected in Thebes, and the final story talking about the expedition to Punt. However, time was catching up with her. Thutmose III was no longer an infant. When he turned 18, it became impossible to stop him from ruling. He had been learned in politics and warfare by then. He ruled as a co-king at first, but Hatshepsut knew that her time would end soon. She had plans for her daughter Nefrur to rule alongside Thutmose III. Historians are unsure whether this royal marriage happened or not. If it did happen, it would have been in the line with everything we know about the monarchy at the time, but there is little evidence to show if Nefrur was indeed queen. Thutmose III eventually became sole king, ruling for another 30 years after Hatshepsut's removal. He led successful military campaigns, built temples, and increased the wealth of his kingdom. In many ways, he not only overcame his aunt's shadow, but surpassed her achievements. However, Thutmose III obviously resented Hatshepsut. After his 30-year reign ended, Thutmose III began rewriting Hatshepsut's past. He removed Hatshepsut's image and statue from temples and other sites that memorialized her, and renaming the masculine statue of Hatshepsut to a male counterpart. Because of Thutmose's influence, it was relatively recently that modern historians discovered Hatshepsut. However, Hatshepsut had the longest rule of any female pharaoh. She ruled for over 2 decades, and she highlighted this wealth by large construction projects of temples to her gods. She expanded the country's territories and established trade routes to new and lucrative locations. All this made her one of the most important pharaohs in Egypt's history. If you want to learn more about this topic, check out the academic resources listed in this episode. The links are in the description below. If you want to keep up with future episodes, please make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out. I'm your host, Efrata Wargo. This episode was written by Adam Sahalu, and we'll see you on the next episode of Humble History.